Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Kyle.
And I'm John.
A guest arrives.
Yes.
Yay! I'm delighted to be here.
Before we actually get started, I just want to remind our listeners that you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com, and we are on Facebook, facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with hosting costs and things like that, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So any help that you would be able to give us would be very greatly appreciated. Today, as we've already said, John is joining us. I met John at Origins 2019 this year. I attended a couple of his lectures, one on authentic world building and another on building realistic faith systems. And the topics and the things that he talked about in that were right up the alley of the things that interest me and the things that I wanted to talk about for this podcast. So I invited him, and I was lucky enough that he said yes to join us.
Not luck. Charisma roll, Clayton.
Exactly.
We all know charisma is my dump set. So, John, whenever we have somebody on the episode for the first time, we always ask them, what's your geek cred? So how are you a geek?
Huh. Maybe the better question is, how am I not? I pay attention to baseball, I suppose. Now that's kind of geeky, isn't it? Because of all the stats, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a geek cred perspective, I'm all in, right? Tabletop gaming, collectible card games, role-playing games. Like I inevitably said in the session that you attended, I started game mastering when I was like 12, which was 1979. So I've been at this a long time, and I don't know what's geekier than writing books for the role-playing game industry, but maybe you guys would have something on offer. But I'm fully in on this stuff. I'm a Trek guy. Role-playing, gaming. I even wrote a book on using games in classrooms. I'm an educator by trade, and and I speak on that as well. So yeah, I got 520 games in my board game collection. That's sort of bronze level geeking, bronze level.
How did you break into the industry initially?
How did I do that? So a friend of mine was working with this guy in Indiana who was publishing a reskinned version of the old DC Heroes role-playing game. And we had played the DC Heroes game throughout the 90s. I didn't GM it. I mostly played. And he said, this guy is looking for people to contribute content to an adventure manual. Okay, that sounds interesting. I wrote something up, and it got published. The game was called Blood of Heroes. The reskin. It was essentially the DC Heroes game, but it was reskinned. And after that, I got a contract from Blood of Heroes to basically write their World Atlas, kind of the setting book. That was never published because the company went under. Huh. But once that happened, right, I got sort of the one credit. It led to me working on a miniatures game that was sort of an orcs versus orcs skirmish kind of thing called Crucible. This is now almost 20 years old now, right? That came out. And then in the era of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, there was a company called Fast Forward that was one of those kind of off-market, if you will, companies that publish source books for 3.5. And, by virtue of the work I'd done on Crucible, I knew someone who worked on Fast Forward's line. So for maybe 3 years, 2002 to 2005, I contributed to dozens of Fast Forward entertainment books. I never wrote one that was mine, because that's not how they did it. They just had a bunch of writers because they really wanted different voices, right, in their content. So I did that. And at that point, I wrote to the old people who managed Rollmaster and said, look, I've got these credits, and here's my work. I can send you 50,000 words of content about what my voice sounds like, kind of my take on things. Rollmaster's always been my favorite game.
I was going to ask why you chose Rollmaster to reach out to specifically.
Well, I wanted to write for them, right? Because it was my game of old, and I was so into the game system that I just wanted to be part of that family, right? And they said, sure, here's some things that we'd like to be done. I thought that loot book sounded interesting. Rather than doing like a whole bunch of charts and stuff, what's the culture of loot, right? What does loot look like in one group to one group of people might not look like loot to someone else? What happens if you get a bag full of paper money issued by, a society that is very sophisticated in its understanding of currency?
One elf's trash is another dwarf's treasure.
Exactly, right? And so, kind of back on this kind of cultural history stuff. So I wrote that book, and then Iron Crown encountered some financial difficulties, as many of these role-playing companies do. And, the other work I was going to do with them kind of went into abeyance. So yeah, not, I haven't been, doing it continuously, but more or less, I've been working on projects almost every year, basically since 2000. I contributed a section to the very first Game of Thrones RPG. I contributed sections to, what's his name? R.A. Salvatore, who wrote all those Drist books for D&D and Forgotten Realms. Well, he did his own world. Fast Forward did some content out of that. I wrote a bunch of that. Some other comic stuff, small stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a hobby, right? You're not gonna be able to buy a boat on the money you're gonna make, but if you're consistent, you can make a little amount. Right. And it's fun to get out there and to sort of share the work with other people. What we're doing right now is sort of ultimately the reason to do it, because it's cool to meet new people.
I was going to ask about your experience with Fast Forward and working with a team of writers. Obviously, you had to have enjoyed it because you kept doing it. But was it always your dream to write something purely on your own?
Totally. I definitely always wanted to be doing my own, kind of my own full take on a thing, whatever that thing is. It was fun to be part of a writing team. I wasn't the editor. I was just a writer. And I appreciated that Fast Forward always was really into my writing voice, and they were interested in the stories that I wanted to tell. The way that these books were written, essentially, you'd give 400, 500, 600 words of creative story content that provided a cultural significance or a context for whatever the magic item you're ultimately writing about is. So you've got a fancy sword. Why is it fancy? You've got this ring. Why does it do what it does? That kind of thing. And it gave me a real opportunity to experiment with really short fiction, and then to come up with some mechanically interesting, object or whatever. But at the end of the day, I would have rather been doing more world building stuff for Fast Forward. Frankly, for anyone, even though that Blood of Heroes, that tour guide that I wrote 20 years ago was never published, it was a super valuable experience to try to conceive of a super heroic universe that starts with, essentially people who are at the sort of street thug level, right, and goes all the way up to sort of, galaxy spanning forces and powers and things of that sort.
So immediately after I got home from Origins, I bought the Folkways book off DriveThruRPG, and
sweet.
I love it. Who would you say is
Yay!
your target audience for these books?
Well, certainly for Folkways, it's game masters, fiction writers, world builders, educators, and players who want to think about their characters from a much deeper perspective than any role-playing system ever asks. Dungeons and Dragons does a very limited amount of development of the culture or the context in which their characters come from. And I think anyone who is interested in those topics would find Folkways of interest.
Yeah, in your Folkways book, each section, each individual Folkway that you talk about has more content in it than the entirety of content that was published for, like, say, elves in Dungeons and Dragons so far in 5th edition.
Right. Right. And that was the goal, right? That was the intention, right? Go so deep that if you were to do everything, in the Folkways book, you'd have almost like a character Bible, right? There is nothing you would encounter in the world would feel like you don't know what you would do or would feel inauthentic. You would know exactly how that character would respond. And, I'm a big believer when I'm a player in quote unquote game mastering up, providing the game master with contexts and stories and threads that the game master might then weave into the story down the road. Mm-hmm. And frankly, if you haven't done the culture work of understanding who your character is before you get into the game, you can't possibly do that in any way that makes sense or holds together. So that was my thinking.
Yeah, that's a big problem that I run into, and I see a lot of other players run into whenever they're making their characters, especially for a new world that they've never played in before, or perhaps the game master has created just for that game. They see a race description and they don't know anything about it, and like particularly Folkways, you break it down so that you're giving the game master you're giving the game master a lot of writing prompts,
right? How
to think about these different areas. You're not really saying, well, these are the different ways that you can do this. You're just asking questions and allowing the game master to fill in all of those blanks.
Right.
I would definitely recommend that if you do not like essays, that this book is probably not for you. But if you're the type of person who likes to like think about things in like long form, like one of the Folkways that is there is like you're talking about. I don't remember the exact term. It's like dress or costumes or something like that.
Yeah,
clothing.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of great content about how does that interplay? Does the culture inform the dress, or does the dress inform the culture? And it's not just it's either one or the other. It's you describe how it's both ways. Form follows function, and function follows form.
Exactly, and this is true across all of these Folkways in some respects, right? If your culture lives by the sea or by the river, and is not by definition vegetarian, they're going to be great fisherfolk, which means they're going to know how to cook it. And they're going to be they're going to have houses that, you dry fish in, and they're going to have use for those scales because people don't waste things, and on and on and on, right? So it's really a matter of, if you ask this question, what answers do you get from it that help you to visualize where these people live and what they think about and what they might care about? You know, what do they have gods that are of the sea? Probably, you know, unless they don't think that way, right? Who does the fishing?
It's so easy to fall back on a stereotype or an archetype of your character class, especially in, say, Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that considering a lot of these different folkways will help you to not just have a noble paladin that butts heads with the rogues. And I was going to say, do we want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these 20 folkways, or perhaps even list a few things without giving away too much, because we do want people to buy the book?
Yes. I've got a boat payment to make, gentlemen.
Well, maybe you didn't waste those scales. You would have the money.
That's right. I would have all this material I need to fix the boat myself. Right.
A couple that surprised me and had me think more about culture, world design, and even just playing a character. The self-reflection.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose rank and order, maybe a little less so, but that last one was well, the last on the list. The first I said, self-reflection is a big one.
Yeah. Some cultures are really introspective, and so they're really aware of what they're doing, how they act, how they interact with others. They really care about being seen as collaborative. And other cultures just sort of blunder through, their interaction with others in ways that drive these other cultures crazy, but that the culture itself is just they're not able to see that what they're doing is harmful to others, or indeed harmful to themselves. And you can see that across the spectrum of human cultures, right? The more sort of collectivist or collaborationist perhaps the culture is, the more likely they are to be introspective, and the less likely they are, the less likely they are to engage in those kind of collective social behaviors, the less likely the culture is to be self-reflective, right? It sort of depends, but it's interesting, I think, to reflect on the way that cultures think about themselves, because sometimes the most interesting place to situate a character or a story is right in the heart of something that a culture is deeply committed to lying to itself about. And every culture's got something.
Sci-fi looks at things through that lens, and I'm big appreciators of that genre.
Yeah. I mean, look at say, The Expanse as an example, right? Earth, Mars, the Belt, they all are deeply committed to an identity that is, at least in part, predicated on telling themselves a story that is heroic but is not true. And it can be very difficult for a character to confront others from other cultures that don't have the same commitment to maintaining the lie as you do if you're in the culture, right? So that's kind of where that one came from. Why is it that that the Canadians, for instance, spend a great deal of time in their public discourse talking about the ways in which majority culture in Canada in the 19th and early 20th centuries actively engaged in cultural genocide against First Nations peoples? when in, say, the United States or in Australia, our public discourse doesn't really ever engage that question.
Yeah, it's sort of glossed over. It's something people see, but I don't recall ever diving into the really...
In any kind of sustained way, Yeah. Why? Right? And, we could talk about that for an hour if this was a history podcast, but for the purposes of building a folk tradition, if your culture responds to the things that it didn't do well or that it should be ashamed of in a way that is reflective, the people coming out of that culture will be along some kind of a continuum that reflects that. And if they aren't, then they're not. Okay. And, Tolkien's dwarves never, ever reflect on the fact that they dug the Balrog out of the deeps. Right? And the Lake Towners never think about the fact that Smaug might have had a point. Right? And so that's where it's coming from, at least.
You're starting to kind of touch on a question that I had for you. You mentioned that you have a background as an educator. You're also, a writer for role-playing content.
Yep.
When you are sitting down to write something like Folkways that, to me, looks very much like a sort of a high-level inventory of sociological parameters and kind of the spectrum of each one of these things.
Right.
When you're creating something like this, which, I guess they're not mutually exclusive, but what is at the forefront of your mind? Are you thinking more about creating an immersive experience for gamers to, have fun at the table? Or how much of it is, educating about the ways that real-world human societal configurations have worked out over our history?
That's a neat question. The second part is not intentional. So to the degree that the book encourages a reader to reflect on human traditions, I think that's great, but it's not the intention. I think certainly as I was reading it and as I was putting together the different ways of understanding these folk traditions, I was thinking about cultures that I'd studied or that I knew or that wanted to get to know a little bit better. But it's not intended in that regard. Rather, because for me the most meaningful role-playing experiences for me as a player and for me as a game master are centered in these questions of culture and decision-making and relationships and long-term growth, character growth. The deeper the inventory of knowledge about a culture that a character emerges from, that a player starts with, the richer and deeper the growth as you play the character. From essentially 1988 to 1997, almost weekly, in one game world that I had designed, 4 generations of characters grew up, adventured, had things happen that were good and bad, and then passed on the mantle of their leadership to the next generation. And doing essentially 10 years of, thousands of hours of development and of game mastering. I just became committed to this idea that if you start from a strong foundation, you don't have to noodle around for 5 or 6 games trying to figure out the character's voice and, what would they think about that and how would they interact with those people? And, I think most people who play these games who I like to play with, I'm not so interested in the sort of Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition, let's make this a miniatures game kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I like miniatures games, but that's not role-playing. That's something else, right? If I'm doing a role-playing game, I want my character to have deep connections to things that matter to the character, and that the people I'm interacting with I should be deeply connected to as well, because we're going through a lot of trauma and hardship. And I think most people who play these games read the books that I cited in the earlier chapters. If you've read your Tolkien and your George R.R. Martin. I mean, George R.R. Martin is all about culture, right? Mm-hmm. Why do the people of the North act the way that they do? Why do the Dothraki have an entirely different worldview? Each house, in some respects, has its own worldview. If you answered the Folkways questions about the Dornish or the Eyrie or the Winterfell or the Iron Islands or whatever, you get totally different answers, which helps to explain why these people, when they clash, the clash feels authentic. It feels real because real things are at stake because it's been developed. If you don't develop it, then it all feels sort of flat to me, and that's not my jam.
Yeah, you don't just have two names of nations and their leaders decide to go to war with each other. You've got actual cultural reasons why these people are clashing and why they have stakes in the conflict that's going on.
Right. That really matters, right? You look at say the Middle Earth. Why does the Inn of the Prancing Pony have hobbit-sized doors, even though hobbits are not big travelers? Well, because it's on a borderland. It's in an intermediate zone between the space of men and the space of hobbits. And some hobbits come, and some live there. Okay, well, that's a kind of multi-ethnic society, and it's reflected in the way that Tolkien writes it, even though he's not implicitly doing it. It's all there if you just pay attention to it.
This question is kind of right in line with what we've been talking about. You, I suppose, are preaching to the choir, or I can at least say that a lot of us have very similar sentiments to your player and game mastering style.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
As a newer to the realm than you, but as an educator myself, this also touches here. How do you... and mind you, we are all correct. This is the best way to game, haha. But if you have a party that is not necessarily of the same, I want to understand why. I want my character to have meaning beyond just a name and character class.
Right.
Say you have a group that are not quite in line with that, but you want to have fun. You want to make sure people are getting to enjoy themselves, but also enjoy the world that you've created. Mm-hmm. How do you impart a lot of this without going crazy, without doing so much work that no one touches on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, my answer to that question is I don't game master those kind of groups.
All right.
I mean, just to be very, to be very direct about it. Now, having said that, I mean, I think if you're going to game master, and y'all have game mastered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's a brutal amount of work to prep. Right? Mm-hmm. You do 10 hours of prep for 5 hours of gaming, and you end up flying by the seat of your pants the whole day anyway, because the dang party does whatever they want to do anyway. Mm-hmm. Right? So why did I even bother to prep? But I did it, right? So my answer is, well, I wouldn't choose to game master that group, because what they want can be better provided by a game master who likes to do that. Okay. Now, having said that, at Origins, my friend Chris and I, who do a Babylon 5 podcast together.
Nice.
Yeah.
What's it called?
It's called The Name of the Pod.
Show notes.
That'll be in the show notes.
Show notes, yeah, and we're coming up on season 5, so we're almost done.
Nice.
So yeah, it's fun. It's fun. Because, J. Michael Straczynski, to segue for a moment, is all about world building, right? Babylon 5 is all about deep, rich cultural questions about, who these different people are and why they act the way that they do and how they interact with, humans and aliens. That's the whole thrust of the show. So for me, it's a great example of the kind of TV that I'm into. But so I don't game master those kind of groups. But with my friend Chris at Origins this year, we did a one-off in the old FASA Star Trek role-playing game system, which was a great system for character creation. The character creation system in that game was dynamite because it basically gave you all of the notes you needed to understand how the character came to be in the position they're in, and all of the different ships they served on and how well that service went, etc. So for each of the characters that I generated and he generated for this game, for a one-off that was going to go 4 hours and done, rather than going into the kind of elaborate detail that I'm talking about in a book like Folkways, I just tried to provide some notes about the ways that they interacted with the world that would help a clever player. We had no idea who we were going to get, right? The hope is we get clever people who have some experience, right? A clever person with experience reading the notes will kind of know what to do. They'll pick up the way the character thinks about the world. The captain of the ship that they were on started his career really badly. He was one of those kind of young people who like to carouse a lot, and highly charismatic, but also perhaps not fully developed in his executive function. And I just put a note in that first cruise that he did that his supervisor suggested that perhaps he might be better served in the Federation Brewing and Distilling Command rather than in Galaxy Exploration Command. And the person who played the captain read that, laughed, and said, "I get it. I know who this guy is." So that's what I'm talking about. It doesn't have to be more than that. But if you're committing to something, a campaign that you want to be of length and of substance, you got to go deeper, to me.
So are there's 20 folkways or there are 20 identified folkways in your book, Folkways.
Right.
That's an awfully even number for us role players.
Yeah, right.
Were there any that you had to either cut because you had come up with too many, or any that you kind of had to drill down a little bit deeper in order to kind of parse it apart and make more content out of, in order to make it that nice round 20 number?
It's so interesting that you raised that, because I'd never ever thought about it until now. There were times in the early drafting when there were more like 24 or 25, and then over time, I just sort of began cutting and combining, and like an environment had 2 or 3 different subsections, and I was like, at the end of the day, environment is just environment, right? I had gender and sexuality separated. I said, I think it's going to be more productive for folks who don't study this kind of stuff to just have it as kind of one concept, right? I think it's better for it to be 2, but I think for playing, for the purposes of the book I'm writing, better for it to be 1. Yeah, I mean, you could easily think, about, take a D20 before you've started playing. You've done the mechanical generation of the character. Now roll a D20. Okay, 14. Tell me a little bit about the way that these people think about rank, or about gender and sexuality, or about magic, or whatever, right? Develop that. Just that. You don't need to do more. You can do more if you want, but I really want to know what your culture thinks about this question. Okay. That's a great way for the player to provide it up, rather than for the game master to have done everything and done all the work.
I wonder what your thoughts are. I assume that you probably noticed this, like a lot of us have that have been gaming for years and years now. It seems pretty clear that the role-playing game hobby has become much more diverse as far as the demographics of people that are now like being welcomed in to participate. As
right.
society with fits and starts kind of moves in a more progressive direction.
Right.
And so when you've got a much more diverse table of players there, and you're presenting a game in the context of this usually seems to happen in medieval fantasy settings, that you've got all of these structures of, based on real historical oppression, be it religious, be it social, whatever.
Right. Right.
It seems like that can often be uncomfortable for a lot of people because of all the vestigial things from that we're still dealing with now. What are your thoughts on that, as far as presenting this world as, a game of fun, but with all of that burden built into it for people to deal with, that are sitting there often facing it in real life?
Yeah. It's an extraordinarily complicated question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. For me, you want to have deep conversation with your players before you start, a game that's going to be one that is going to be more than a one-off. In a one-off, maybe you're not going to really know kind of where your players are coming from, and you're not going to understand, their worldview, their perspective. I'm a big believer in respecting the fact that everyone has a difficult journey. Everyone's walking in a path that life has set out for them, and a game space is one that's supposed to be fun and engaging, and shouldn't kind of obligate you to continually have to confront things that are challenges in your life. Now, in a game that's running for a longer period of time, maybe that's a great way to actually confront those things, is to do it within a game space, to try on some answers and to try on some perspectives. But that's not for everyone. What I like about the book as written and published is that it explicitly asks you to think about these notions, like notions of wealth or notions of authority, not from the vantage point of your typical kind of Western European feudal, AD 1300 plus or minus 100 years perspective, but from a perspective that uniquely comes from your experiences. I mean, what else can you bring other than your own experience, right? Mm-hmm. And so the hope is that by offering a book like this that doesn't say, well, this kind of way of being in the world is fundamentally wrong, and this kind is fundamentally right, would allow a player group and a game master to come to some kind of a framework or a context where players can feel free to work on social, cultural, personal matters, behaviors, realities that they want to work on, and not be confronted with things that they don't. And most game systems that are sort of, for the mass, don't really pay very good attention to that. Niche games, smaller games, are often quite good at it. I just bought. I haven't played it yet, but I just bought from Kickstarter 2 games written by 2 indie RPG writers. One of them is called Dream Askew, and one of them is called Dream Apart. And Dream Askew asks you to take on the identity of a character working in some kind of a GLBTQ space in a sort of dystopian society. Things have gone badly wrong, and you have sort of gathered with your quote unquote tribe to try to endure. And it's kind of a collaborative storytelling kind of game. Avery Adler, I think, is the writer. She wrote The Quiet Year,
Actually, about to say
one of my
this reminds
all-time
me of The
favorite.
Quiet Year, but I couldn't think of the author name. Very cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing, right? The Quiet Year. Oh my God, what a game!
We all agree.
God bless. Yeah. Whew. To die. Let me. Dream Apart is not Avery Adler, but one of her collaborators, and it's set in 19th century shtetl, in the Pale of Settlement. Where you're a Jewish community that is severely isolated from other communities, and you face challenges, and you have to confront them. So certainly games like that are explicitly bringing forward these questions in a way that Dungeons and Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade and those guys, they're really not. But The Quiet Year, I talk about it all the time, and I'm glad that you guys have played it and dig it, because I can remember at Gen Con a number of years back, I was at the table, 3 dear friends. We realized when we started, we have more than 100 years game mastering experience at this table. This game should really resonate for us. And when we were done, 4 hours later, we're staggering out of the room like, oh, that was the most meaningful experience I've ever had at a role-playing table. It was extraordinary. I could text any one of them right now and just say, Andrew. They'd know exactly what I was referencing. This little scamp, Andrew. Good grief. Enough of that. So yeah, it's a super complicated question, right? Because, if you haven't composed your group effectively, then you end up spending all your time policing and mediating these questions that are just not productive in a game space.
Well said. That's that last bit especially is a related but different and no less complicated struggle, and not the topic of this episode, but
Truth.
worth discussing sometime.
Right. Yeah. Right. I'll come back on. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. We've mentioned in passing several things that we could probably do a full episode on, or have done a full episode on. Mm-hmm. We're starting to get kind of where I want to start wrapping it up. So you've got a new book coming out, Beyond the Veil. What is it about?
Yep. Beyond the Veil is an attempt to try to make sense of clerics as a class, and to go very deep on the question of religion and spirituality. Okay. So to the first part, my contention in the that I make in the introduction, sort of the thesis of the book, is that when tabletop role-playing games were being invented, the people writing them, who by and large were indifferent to questions of spirituality and religion, or were in fact actively disinterested, the atheist or what have you, they had a really clear sense of what a fighting man, a fighter was, what a magician was, because of the books they'd read and what they had, kind of learned as younger people before they wrote these books. They had no idea really about what clerics were supposed to be. So you end up with this kind of weird mishmash character class. Is it about healing? Are they doctors? Is it about turning the undead? Are they sort of like vampire hunters? What are they? And why all these weird restrictions about armor and weapons that they might use? Doesn't make any sense. And then as they come to realize this, and you get more and more development of content in Dungeons and Dragons and and Rollmaster, etc., you end up with the most superficial Western pantheistic, polytheistic approach to religion that that you could ever think about coming up with. And then though that just gets reified. It just gets done over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And these gods never impose expectations on their followers, and they never They never grant certain kinds of boons and take away certain other kinds, and they never expect you to use a particular kind of weapon or to heal in a particular kind of way, or not to heal these people but only these kind, and on and on. So the idea is this character class doesn't really make any sense. Let's see if we can do something with it. And secondarily, as if Zeus and Thor and Set were the only kind of gods there are that humans have ever come up with. So I do a big section where I look at dozens and dozens and dozens of human-generated religious and or spiritual systems and talk about what informs them, okay? So, for instance, Christianity is about love. Judaism is about mitzvah, obligations, ritual obligations, right? The ancient Mesoamerican religions are about sacrifice. But I go beyond that and say, well, look, in our contemporary world, we've got lots of systems of belief that they don't classify themselves as religion, but you could use them in a game setting to be sort of religion-ish, or that they might function in that way. So I talk about, for instance, the state philosophy of North Korea is called Juche, which is this complicated notion of self-reliance and community, collaborative, shared building of the society. Well, you could take that and easily claricize it in a society that was deeply committed to self-reliance, or that viewed itself as being deeply threatened by other societies, and on and on. So we've got a lot of study of religion, ancient, contemporary, and then examples of how that might express itself, different kinds of cultures, different kinds of cultures that emerge from a particular kind of religious or spiritual perspective, and then a bunch of different ways of looking at clerics. Well, maybe the cleric is more like this, or maybe it's more like this. And, if you're going to use the Western pantheistic tradition, you're welcome to. But a cleric of the water is going to expect certain things of you, and these are those things. And a cleric of lust is going to expect certain things of you, and so on and so on, right?
And one more time, not for me, because my mind is an aluminum trap, but for our listeners. When was that book approved to be released?
My expectation is that it will come out at the end of 2019. Yeah.
Jon, thank you very much for being on here. Usually the last thing that we do when we wrap up a podcast is we talk about like any geek things that are going on or that we are aware of that we wanted to make our listeners aware of. I don't feel like I need to do that this time because you are literally my geek thing, and this entire podcast has been about you. But I'll let you. Do you have anything that is going on, or just a piece of trivia, or a cultural thing that's going on that you just want to share and let other people know that's going on?
Huh. Well, you've kind of stumped me. But one of the things I'll share is that in October 10, 11, and 12, here in Southern California, I am co-chairing the education component of an independent game fair festival called Indiecade. Now, it's really much more about video games, and I'm really more about tabletop. But Indiecade's going to have a big tabletop and other cards, etc. presence than they've had in the past. And on the Saturday, which I think is October 12th, we're going to have a full day of workshops for teachers and educators who are interested in game-based learning and gamified instruction, and a great opportunity for the educators in the audience to come out and have a look. This conference is amazing from what I've seen. I've got many friends who've participated in it, but it's always conflicted with a work obligation for me until this year. So I was planning on going, and one of the developers, of the curriculum said, "Hey, we want to do this education thing, and you've written a book about it, and we think you'd be the guy to co-chair it." So Indiecade, I think Indiecade.org is the...
Great, thanks. You guys?
So come on out.
Yeah, I got one. So as a software developer, I like to keep people apprised of new and interesting things in that space. I've recently become aware of a new JavaScript library called Svelte. That's Svelte. It's a svelte.dev. And what this is, if you're interested in getting into programming, especially web development stuff, it is an extremely simplified and concise way of creating web applications from something as simple as just a one-page like character generator all the way up to a full-blown web app that you could make an entire game system within. And it works extremely efficiently. It has very few components to it, and it's very, very user-friendly to step into it. It would be one of the very first things that I would hand someone who is just learning programming. And so if anyone is feeling creative in the tech space along those lines, check it out. It's definitely a up-and-coming technology that's probably going to be really influential in the near future.
Mine, in true to my own form fashion, is something that came out in 2007, so it's not exactly new, but it's new to me. I recently picked up a game for the Nintendo DS, which I recently acquired one of those now very outdated handheld consoles. And this game is called Hotel Dusk Room 215, and it's basically a point-and-click adventure game. It requires you to hold that twin-screened handheld system sideways like a book, which is pretty neat. And it is a story of a New York City police officer who fell afoul of something and was canned from the force, and he is now a traveling salesman. Did I just cut out? Okay, we've got a recording local here, though.
Yeah, we've got a recording local.
Anyway, he was canned from the force and has now moved out into the western half of the country to be a traveling sales stuff from his past. New characters, I'm not sure if it's a series or not, but really well-written character dialogue, and it does some very creative things with a handheld system that has two discs, one of them being a touchscreen.
Very cool. Well, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Okay.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.